Kuhle kwethu. That is a beautiful excerpt from a composition by SBP Mnomia. Kuhle kwethu. I think it's from Ingqayizivele. Good afternoon and welcome to the Choralist Conversations. Today we are hosting a special conversation, which is a collaboration between the Choralist and the University of Fort Hare, the music department at the University of Fort Hare. If you're a singer, you're a conductor, you're an audience member, an adjudicator, a music teacher, if you have any involvement in music, this conversation is yours. It is not only for composers, but all of us who work with the music, because the music that the composers compose, it is the music that we listen to, it is the music that we work with, we workshop, we compete with, we sing as singers. So a discussion like this involves everybody. Please take your friends, your colleagues, your conductor, your choristers, your students. Everyone is welcome. All contributions are much valued in this kind of conversation. And these kind of conversations are very important and are necessary for the growth of choral music in South Africa. This afternoon, we have an exciting lineup of panelists as part of this composers conversation. But my facilitator this afternoon will introduce the guests, the four composers. It seems like one of the composers is experiencing network challenges. The weather is very bad. We'll see if we are able to get hold of him, or Dr. Andile Khumalo. And to facilitate this conversation, I am joined by UTV Thembela Vokwana from the music department at the University of Fort Hare. Let me get TV. Hear me?
Hello.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear bits of you. I'm struggling with network. I've had to change between networks from Telecom to Vodacom, and hopefully, can you hear me though?
Yes, I can hear you. I can hear you, even though the
wonderful. I'm struggling with network also on my side. It's where I am. It's raining and it's thundering, and I've had to shift between two networks. Ndiyavakala?
Yes, we have Vakala TV. We can hear you.
All right.
Even though
wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. I have with me a group of composers, South African composers, who work and live in different parts of the world. I've got Mr. Mokale Koapeng, who lectures in Zambia and is a South African composer and has done wonderful things in composition. He has a master's from the University of the Witwatersrand, and he has lectured at the University of Witwatersrand. He has also lectured at UNISA, and he has lectured also at FUBA, and he holds a master's in music composition. And Mokale has composed for a number of ensembles and for international festivals as well, and including Consonance Festival in France, Salisbury Community Choir in the UK, and the Gillespie String Trio in Ireland. But also Mokale is a very versatile musician. He composes across genres. He works with jazz, he works with choral music, and he also works with other genres. And Mokale, at the moment, he is based in Zambia. And also, I have an opera singer. I have an opera singer in our midst, who is also a composer. We've got Musa in our midst. And let me quickly just go to Musa's bio. And Musa Nkuna was born in Guyana in Limpopo and he and I are the same age. We are both 21. And his father, Leslie Nkuna, is also a composer, and he's been an active composer and is also a professional opera singer. And this is what I find very exciting about Musa's work, because he's an opera singer first and foremost, but he also does quite a lot of composition. And he's been in Europe for the past 20 years. Musa has performed in leading roles in 99 opera productions. We're hoping for one more so that he makes 100. And he does a lot of concert work and recitals in countries such as Austria, Belgium, France, Germany, Greece, Holland, Poland, Portugal, Russia, Switzerland, and South Africa. So up to now, Musa has composed 36 complete works, which include 4 song cycles, a large-scale requiem, a cello concerto, a cantata, several compositions for varied instrument combinations, and all sorts of other things. Musa holds a BMS from the University of Durban Westville, which he got cum laude, and then an MS in composition from Rhodes, and an MS in performance, which he also got cum laude from Lausanne in Switzerland. He's got an MA, and he has got 3 masters, dear God. MA in Arts and Culture Management from Berlin in Germany, a postgraduate diploma in German language studies, and a university licentiate in music obtained with distinction through UNISA. He also has a university teacher's licentiate in music. So what we can then say about Musa is that Musa likes studying, he likes performing, he also likes composition. Let's take a breather, and I'll get back to the other remaining composers later on. And let's welcome everybody. And I'd like to give a number of questions to the composers. And I think when we were planning this, Musa said to me, Thembela, I don't like the question, tell us about yourself. And I think maybe the question should be, tell us what we don't know about you already. I tried to read a little bit of your bio, quite very fast. So tell us what we don't know about you. Maybe something about your background, something that links you to performance and composition. Yeah.
Well, I as you have already mentioned, I grew up in Guyana. I was born in Guyana, born into a musical family, so I grew up with a lot of music at home. I grew up with choral music, with traditional music, with Xitsonga pop music, and so on and so on. So I couldn't escape, the bug of being bitten by the love for music. Well, that's that's all I can say. So, well, like most South African musicians, or especially singers that I know, we started in church, singing in a church choir, singing in a school choir, and then my love for music grew from there up to a point where I went to study and then became a professional musician. Yeah, that's my life story in short.
All right, Mokale, can you hear us? Can you get us?
I can get you. Yes, I can hear you very well.
Wonderful. Tell us what we don't know about you. The tell me about yourself questions is problematic. But if you want to engage it right away, do that. Who is Mokale, the composer?
Well, that's a very interesting thing when you say who is Mokale, the composer, because in taking hello. Can you hear me?
No, I can't. I can't hear you, Mokale.
Yeah, I don't know. Microphone is on.
I can hear you now.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay. Yeah, can everybody hear me? Musa?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes, I can hear you and I can see you.
Can you hear me? Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you, my friend. Yeah. Thembela, you know,
Yes, I can.
when you say Mokale, tell us about, tell us something that we do not know about you. Who is Mokale? It's an interesting certain spaces where I do certain things. For Musa in the 80s, then at a later stage, I became an adjudicator, got involved in conducting nation building, but not known as a composer. As a matter of fact, it's only one of my compositions that are known by, interestingly, what one might call black choirs. So they're an interesting dynamic for me, and I've thought through then there's another space where I am known as a composer in wide spaces, wide audiences, where I would be, get commissions to write instrumental music, write, choral music. But largely music. Yeah. So as a church pianist, accompanying congregations and conducting my church choir, and even though one of the groups that I led started operating outside the that you have asked, quite interesting and quite pertinent for me. A narrative, a discourse around spaces and what people know about composers, then I get our interaction is quite interesting. Yeah.
Mokale, we're struggling to hear you. We're struggling to hear you. I hope maybe at a later stage you will get back to maybe give us a few things about you, and tell people, because I'm not sure whether what I'm hearing is also what other people are hearing. I'm really just struggling to hear you. But I also want to introduce somebody else also in the panel, Bongani Ndodana-Breen, who is also another composer that we're talking to here. Right. Bongani, you're from Queenstown, am I right? Or you're from Grahamstown? Bongani, can you hear me?
Hi, Bongani, sorry, I had to unmute my. Yeah, okay. I can hear you now. I had to unmute myself.
Are you from Queenstown or are you from Grahamstown?
I was born in Queenstown. My family comes from there, but I grew up mostly in Grahamstown and boarding school there. So I can't really say I've got memories of Queenstown because I hardly spent any time there. And I think I haven't been there since 1994. So, yeah.
Okay. Right. Bongani is clearly an Eastern Cape. In the Eastern Cape, we always like to, find relations, and maybe if then you will be from my father's mom's lineage and all that. So, Eastern Cape people are always trying to connect. But what matters is that Bongani Ndodana-Breen is a composer, a very versatile composer of symphonic works and opera and chamber music. He composed Winnie the Opera, which is based on the story, the life history of Winnie Mandela. He also has composed Credo, an oratorio based on the Freedom Charter, and Harmonia Ubuntu, which was premiered by the Minnesota Orchestra on the historic tour to South Africa. Bongani Ndodana holds a PhD in music composition from Rhodes University, and he was also awarded a Radcliffe Fellowship by Harvard University. He won the Standard Bank Young Artist Award for Music in 1998 and was also selected as one of the Mellon Guardian 200 Young South Africans for 2011. For many years, he was the director of the Ensemble Noir in Toronto, Canada. He has received commissions from Wigmore Hall in London and the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston and the Minnesota Orchestra, Vancouver Recital Society, Madam Walker Theatre in Indianapolis, Miller Theatre of New York, Hong Kong Chinese Orchestra, Luminato Festival in Toronto, and also UNISA. And he has also worked with Johannesburg Philharmonic Orchestra and the Hayden Festival in Eisenstadt in Austria. He is currently working on a new composition from Stanford University in the United States. So what is clear and obvious in today's conversation is the fact that we have people who are composers and who have an international presence. They don't only just work in South Africa, but their work is commissioned and is performed by international orchestras and ensembles. And maybe the first question that I will direct to everybody is, what does it take to be a composer? Clearly, you are professional composers. We have got another composer who's struggling to get online, Andile Khumalo. Andile Khumalo lectures at the University of Witwatersrand at Wits. He's a senior lecturer in composition. Mokale also works in an institution. He is a lecturer in composition, and he has lectured in different spaces as a composer. Bongani holds a doctorate in composition, and Musa is an opera singer, but also a professional composer. So maybe the first thing that we should be engaging on, and that maybe is hopefully going to excite a lot of young composers that we work with, and a lot of young people that are interested in composition, is what do you need to be a professional composer? Because clearly today, and having read all your bios, we're not just talking to people who just compose because they like it, but we're talking to people who compose because clearly they have studied composition, they have mastered the art, they even teach it. Whoever goes ahead and explain, what does it take to be a composer? What does one need to be a professional composer? Bongani?
Well, let me start then. I think composition is something that one has to go into seriously. And it's not something that you just skim through or fake your way through it. How I became a composer is that I studied piano, and I also played in our school orchestra. I was a very bad viola player and not quite so bad a French horn player. But I was fascinated with instruments. And that, I think, helped me in my journey as a composer in terms of how do these instruments work? What can a clarinet do? What can a French horn do? What can a cello do? And that was the first fascination. And then the second thing, of course, was learning the musical language, having to learn harmony and counterpoint. And all of that. And I think it was only after that foundation that I had the confidence to be able to write my first and early pieces, which happened in my late teens. And of course, you make a lot of mistakes along the way. And I mean, there's some works that I remember from my early 20s that I'm rather embarrassed about, bits of juvenilia, I suppose. But you tend to grow with each work that you do, and you have to, as I said, you have to immerse yourself into, I mean, orchestration manuals, etc., and find mentorships. I was mentored in my third year by the composer Roelof Temming, who was my teacher for a while. And that kind of mentoring, I think, is important in helping you develop your voice. And I mean, just one tiny little thing that Roelof Temming taught me is to compose away from the piano. Most people, when they compose at the piano, and that in a very subconscious way, for example, limits what they write, because they write only what their technique at the piano is at. So they constrain themselves. So I had to, that was one thing I think I learned from Temming, and also just to be able to use what you called your mind's ear, i.e. being able to pick up an orchestral score and be able to hear the music without you having to go and bang the notes away at the piano, etc. I mean, those kinds of little techniques, but I'll pass it on to somebody else.
Right. Mokale, do you have any interesting insights about how you learned to be a composer and also how people can become composers?
The church played a formative role, if I may say, because my first composition was a short choral piece, just like Bongani said. Well, in my case, I was in my 20s, and I'm a bit embarrassed. I'm quite embarrassed by what I wrote then, looking at what I know and what I'm capable of doing right now. But I think it was an important step in the sense that I had to start. But my undergraduate studies did not include composition per se, but I studied harmony and composition with Roelof's brother Henk Temming, Professor Henk Temming, at Wits, and also Carl van Wyk. Then for orchestration, I studied with the late Professor Moni. Now, that actually understood the importance of studying composition, studying orchestration, as Bongani mentioned. I think that's one of the critical things that are essential in composition. And talking about composing from the piano, yes, like you rightly say, Bongani, your technique on the piano will definitely limit you. And I think the other thing for me, which is quite important, is listening to other composers, looking at scores, and trying out different styles. And I guess this is one of the things that we'll discuss later in terms of writing styles, because when you start talking of stylistic differences and approaches, in certain spaces, for instance, in South Africa, you find that what people know and what people are exposed to limits, their appreciation of what something that is new that you present to the audience. So listening to different composers, listening to different styles, studying scores, and in addition to just the study of harmony, counterpoint, and orchestration is critical. Yeah.
Right, that's exciting. I think what for me is emerging in today's conversation is study. Musa, what are your experiences? Tell us about how you learned, because you also have your father, which I think may have led you to composition, or sometimes, the relationship between fathers and sons, you might actually, want to do away with what your father has what your father keeps on wanting you to do. You know, that kind of dynamic within a family space. What are your experiences? Would you like to share with us something? Unmute yourself, Musa. Yeah.
Okay.
I must unmute myself.
We can hear you now.
Yeah, okay. Well, my case is also a little bit like the other composers in many ways. Well, I grew up with a father who is a composer. I couldn't escape it because, you know, composers his age used to compose in tonic solfa. I mean, a lot of people still do. Used to compose in tonic solfa, and you could not buy tonic solfa manuscripts like you would find staff notation manuscripts. So those little lines that he had to draw in order to compose, my elder brother and I used to draw lines for him. He taught us how to do that. So for instance, if he wanted to write something in 3-pulse measure, I would say, I would like to write something in 3-pulse measure. And then he showed us how to do the little lines and the dots so that he could just come in and write. And at the time, well, in Guyana, we didn't have photocopy machines and things like that. So if he wanted, if he knew his song would be, let's say, 120 bars, we had to do 120 bars of those lines. So we did that. So then tomorrow he would come and say, I'm going to write something in 4/4. You didn't even, well, it said in 4-pulse measure, so we'd do that. Okay. And then while I was doing all this, it became fascinating for me to draw those little lines. I was a little boy, 7, 8, when it all started. And then when I joined the school choir, of course, at home we used to sing, but of course we couldn't even read tonic solfa, but he taught us how to read tonic solfa. We learned that also at school. So when we got a little older, what I can remember when I was 11, since I was 11, he would give us his music we would sing, you know, we would all just check it when it finished composing to sing it all together so he could hear whether it all blended well. And that's how my love for wanting to be a composer also started. Of course, I met a Swiss missionary who was working in Guyana, Paulette Robert, who was she was a pianist, and she taught me most of the things that I learned at that age, around from when I was about 14, 15. She taught me to read staff notation, and she made me listen to all sorts of music, you know. I still remember when I had Stravinsky for the first time. It was in a house, and I thought it was the ugliest music ever. I mean, I had never, you know, coming from tonic solfa choral music background, it was very difficult to accept that kind of music. But she made me listen to all that, and she gave me this love for opera. Also watching, you know, I would sit there. You remember, we still have those LPs. So she would play me the LP of Don Giovanni, and I would be trying to follow with the score, not being able to read correctly, especially with the recitatives, with all the free time and all. It was very difficult. But then when I went to university in my undergraduate studies, I was fortunate to meet teachers and composers who became very interested in really teaching us something, so that when we go out of university, we go out with knowledge, not just obtaining a bachelor's degree, which wouldn't be quite useful at the end. So one of the courses we did theory of music, but they called it, Christine Lucia had changed it in our department. It was called compositional techniques. So from that point of view, when learning theory of music, one realized, okay, this is a way of, you know, trying to compose. Actually, it's not just theory, which is not usable, but it's techniques which you can learn to become a composer. And then I did composition 1 and composition 2 in my 3rd and 4th years. So my bachelor's degree actually ended up being a Bachelor of Music degree with specialization in composition and in performance. Then I went over at Rhodes. It was very interesting because that's where I did my master's in composition. And that's where I learned quite a lot about orchestration, about composing for different instruments. I studied with Michael Blake. He was my mentor, and we still work together. I'm working on a project with him. And these kinds of things, you know, it's I learned a lot about orchestration and how to write for different instrumental combinations and so on and so on. Yeah, but basically coming from this is very interesting for me and very important, especially when I listen to music of other composers, because I listen a lot. I listen to African Kaddish, by the way, this morning, Bongani, because I love it. For some reason, it evokes a lot of feelings for me. It gives me pleasure. It makes me sad. It makes me happy. I find it a really beautiful piece. I think I told you this one day. And so when I listen to, yes, pleasure. When I listen to other composers, I realize that in a way, my composition style is mostly influenced by my profession as an opera singer, hearing a lot of melodies all the time. And I have this thing for loving melodies. It's just in my nature. I love melodies, and I love writing something melodious. I just love creating messages, not messages, melodies all the time. So it's yeah, I come from that kind of background. That's why my music will also always sound quite melodious.
Right. That's very exciting, Musa. It seems to me that the central premise here is that everybody must study. And so I'm hoping that everybody who is out there and listening to this conversation and who aspires to be a composer, the basic thing that matters is the fact that one needs to study, one needs to develop the talent, so that it's not only just a question of putting together the kind of things that you already know.
May I butt in, if you don't mind?
What?
May I jump in here?
All right, jump in.
Just to say, I mean, you say that people must study. I would actually qualify that. You must inherently be curious about music. And I mean, I think all the composers on the panel are musically very inquisitive people. You know, when we see a piece of music, we dive in very deep. And I think that's part of how, you learn as a composer. You can't just listen to something very passively. You really go down into things very deeply. And so I don't think you're going to be a good composer unless you are a curious musician to begin with. When you're hearing something, you say, how did they do that? And then you go and you sink into the score. That's how it's done.
Yes, true. Yeah, it's just to add on that, it's very interesting because I think as a composer also, when you listen to music of other composers, I mean, even music, like I listen also to, if it's normal, I listen to Mozart and I listen to Verdi, Puccini, Strauss, and all that. I always get fascinated. How he composed? What was he thinking about when he? And when I listen to fellow living composers now, it's very interesting to see. I really get surprised and get amazed all the time by the sounds I hear, these different sound combinations that people are able to put together and say, wow, isn't it amazing that an African composer, for instance, for me, this is very important, but an African composer is actually able to make his composition sound very African without a hint of being artificial at all in what he's trying to do. I find that a lot of music, for instance, music of my fellow composers, when I hear their music, it sounds very authentic because you can hear this is not borrowed. One doesn't always try to borrow from the African traditions, but it's the music that one grew up with. It just to me sounds like it flows without difficulties.
Mokale,
I just want to make a remark about being inquisitive and always trying to look for new things and being excited by new ideas and all that. My experience is that that kind of an approach, which is quite exciting for me and something that I will continue doing, is that like earlier on when I mentioned spaces. the idea of being inquisitive and trying out new things, being inspired, allowing yourself to be inspired by different composers or different ideas or different musical, ideas, is that can, get you in trouble with possibly your traditional audience, unless if you have an audience that is interested in listening or experiencing new things. But my experience is that whenever I get commissioned, I look at the kind of audience that will will possibly listen to my music and sort of respond accordingly, because I've had experience where I write something, then people will say, but this is not our kind of music. And I'll just laugh it off because I understand what they mean by that and why they would say that. Yeah.
Right. Well, that leads me to the next question that we had a conversation about it yesterday, and maybe we need to take it forward as a group and we engage with it and invite other people who are listening. The idea of our music. And I was telling Bongani that we had just listened to his opera, Winnie Mandela the opera, and one of the conductors that I absolutely love because he's a great musician, he came to me and he says, Thembela, that was not our music. And I could not respond. And so, Bongani, here you are. And tell us about this notion of our music. And I think in dealing with this notion of our music, we're going to get into the 1-4-5 chordal progression, which is so much based on hymns that came with the missionaries and which have actually become the tonal language or the compositional language that we use. And so the 1-4-5 has become our music. Can you unpack the idea of our music? What does it mean what does it mean when we say this is our music and any other kind of chordal progression is not our music? Any kind of tone, maybe atonal language is not our music. It's all up to you, really. You are the guys who are composers. Mina, I'm just a musicologist.
Thembela, you are going to cause me to get a lot of hate mail about what I'm about to say. I would just like to segue onto what Mokale was talking about, which is how he tries to, in a way, mediate, I think, for his audience, depending on who's commissioning the piece. I think that's a valid fear for any composer. And I would wish that composers or the next generation of South African composers do not have to do that, because composers elsewhere don't do that. They write what they like. And I mean, can you imagine Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, thinking like, oh, what am I going to say? I'm going to have 4 helicopters and, the helicopter quartet, for instance. He just said, like, this is it, take it or leave it. And I think this ties into a bigger, I think, philosophical conversation about art. Art is a very risky business, and artists have to be brave people. If you look at, the great pieces of art, just the visual art alone, Kandinsky, and then all these great artists, and the kind of risks that they have to do. You'll recall, for instance, I mean, a musical example that's quite common is the premiere in 1913 of Les Sacres du Printemps, the ballet by Stravinsky, The Rite of Spring. I mean, he had to leave the concert hall via the bathroom window because there was a riot. I'm not encouraging that kind of behavior, but I think composers have to take risks, and I'm hoping that we can live in a world where the genius of Mokale Koapeng is not compromised by sensitivities of audience members who are rather lazy listeners, let's just say, okay? That's the first thing. And then the second thing that you mentioned, which is much more of a historical and legacy thing. And I I think we need to acknowledge, as Black South Africans, especially the choral music community, that some of our music, actually most of the music that is out there in a South African choral music, is deeply embedded in the vestiges of the colonial project. Okay, let's put that out there. And this is deeply rooted in those hymn books that were published by Lovedale, which was a very good thing at the time, in the mid 1800s. And the introduction of tonic solfa. Tonic solfa was introduced in the Eastern Cape by Christopher Burkett, again in the late 1800s. These are all colonial vestiges. We were singing before that. We were making music before that. And as a composer, I'm curious about that pre-colonial culture, which now is mainly in the domain of ethnomusicologists or African music scholars, and is not part of the mainstream. But that being said, there's a great deal of value, I think, in tonic solfa, but I think we must understand as musicians, as South African musicians, and as composers, the limitations of tonic solfa, how it constrains our ability, for instance, to notate rhythms, how it constrains our ability in terms of using chromaticism in the music and portraying all other complexities. And again, I would go back to the analogy that I made about composing at the piano, which is how limiting it is. And I think in an intellectual way, sometimes I believe that tonic solfa constrains you into this tonic dominant relationship, and also being able to stay in a relatively narrow cycle of keys. You can't make drastic modulations from one tonal center to the other without everybody screaming at you, because basically the actual musical language becomes unreadable and impractical for people. That being said, is how can we make room for progressive ideas and progressive artistic adventures in the South African choral music community? I hear you, Thembela, that when my opera Winnie, which in Europe and in North America, my opera Winnie is regarded as being very conservative. And I'm so sorry that our brother, Andile Khumalo, Dr. Khumalo, is not here with us, because I would be curious to see what your colleague would have thought about his music, because his stuff is like all the spectral stuff that he does, which is it's fantastic stuff. But I think we need to embrace some progressive thinking as the choral music community, and I think we need to expand the musical language beyond beyond this romantic 18th century, 19th century kind of style. It's so sad to me when you're hearing people that are writing music in 2020, and it sounds like very bad copies of Mozart. And I think we need to embrace progressive ideas that way. And then secondly, I just wish, and it goes back to something that Mokale and Musa also talked about in their talk. I wish people would study and be curious about music more before they decide to write their own music. So go into other people's scores, just go in there and be curious before you decide to express yourself. That's my 2 cents worth for now.
Right. Mokale, in your master's thesis, you say you write what you like.
Yeah.
Can I engage more with that? I find your thesis exciting because you engage with decoloniality. You engage with Fanon. So your theoretical engagement with your composition and your composition aesthetic is very much rooted in African kind of systems of thought, if I'm correct. But at the same time, you say you write what you like. And then if you write what you like, do you like it because you're African? Do you like it because you're Mokale? What does it mean to write what you like? What does it mean to compose in an idiom that maybe is just you? And so I'm excited about the possibility of engaging what it means to compose as an African composer, writing within a space, an academic space, a compositional space that is largely Western. What does that mean for you? What does it mean for you to be Mokale, who composes what he likes within a space, within the academy, that has got other things that it likes?
Yeah, like I said before, talking about spaces, it's just unfortunate that for African composers, we have to sort of identify ourselves as African composers rather than say, I'm a composer first, and then an African second. I have engaged, tried to deal with that phenomenon of composer first, African second, or African first, composer second, and all of that. And that also, reflects itself in some of the works that I've created. For instance, Countries in Memoria, 76, which was commissioned by the Standard Bank National Arts Festival. When I developed that work, I just decided to look at myself or consider myself a composer first. Decided to write what I like or include, things that I like in my composition. So one can say, there's a bit, there's a lot of jazz. There's a lot of, nothing can be linked to the colonial project per se. And so with that work, I actually looked at myself as a composer first. But there are instances where I think it becomes important that I consider myself and look at myself as an African composer. That's when I would, like to look at incorporation of African elements in. I really don't like, that kind of a description, but look at, be inspired by African music, borrow or, well, I can't say steal because you don't steal something that is yours. I'm an African. Borrow from my African, compositional techniques in terms of indigenous music. So, there are pieces, for instance, my string quartet, Komeng, was actually inspired by no Finichi Drillies, Umyayezelo, the bow music. And well, somebody might say, hey, that's minimalism, but hey, Philip Glass, your favorite composer, Bongani, now I'm provoking you. Philip Glass went to Ghana and studied African music, so you can't say minimalism is a...
You mean Steve Reich?
I mean, Steve Reich, rather. I'm sorry, Steve Reich, yes. So you can't say minimalism is not African. For goodness sake, it was inspired by African music. So when I say I write what I like, I want, as a composer, to express myself. If at that particular point when I compose, I'm inspired by a mbera, yes, let me just flow. Let me just allow the creative juices to flow. If at a particular point I'm inspired by jazz, let me do that. By the way, I said, I just wanted to say something regarding, a story that an incident that I experienced when I got commissioned by the Nation Building Mass Choir Festival. I wrote this 9-minute piece, Fatlego sa gago. And in that piece, I said, I want to bring all my musical experiences together, which incorporated, African music, the music that is mainly inspired by the colonial project, brought, jazz. I tried to fuse all those things together. And guess what? One of, I'm sorry to say respectfully, one of the senior conductors in that festival said, but this is not our music. Oh, wow, interesting. So the issue of our music is problematic to me. I prefer, rather than talking of our music, I prefer my music presented to our people. So it's a very difficult space for me, TV. Yeah.
Okay. Musa, what have you to say about our music? What is your music? What is our music? And I know you and I have had serious conversations, especially about the whole idea of a language group, an ethnic group, a group that is kind of marginalized within the South African space. You are Tonga. I hope that's correct, because there's always some very interesting dynamic whether people are Tonga or Shangaan. So please correct us in that. And you're very concerned about ways in which your people are kind of excluded within the South African mainstream, both in terms of language, in terms of musical performance, that there are very few compositions from that population group. And then how do you wish to actually engage with this?
Well, I think about 20, 25, maybe let's say the last 30 years, there has been a shift in South African choral music, basically, because you will also agree. I hope Bongani and Mokale will agree with me that a lot of these comments, these kind of strange comments that would be passed to them, would be comments coming basically from choral music composers, because mainly of our limited, would I be correct if I say limited knowledge of other styles of music outside of the 145 that you spoke about earlier. So, but about 20, let's say, I would say in the last 25, 30 years, there was a huge change, especially that was brought in by choral composers. I will use the word choral composers of Zulu and Xhosa background at the time. I remember hearing music by Bo Tono and so on. It sounded to me at the beginning, this was completely different from what I had been brought up with. Hearing parallel fifths and hearing parallel fourths, hearing parallel octaves, didn't seem somehow sounded kind of strange, hearing hearing a pentatonic scale instead of the usual, it became very, very difficult. So, but in terms of that kind of development in my from the area I come from Limpopo, there hasn't been that much incorporating our, what we call, our own music into choral music. So it hasn't moved much. There's still a lot of use of 145 and diatonic tribe. It's not. It's very difficult. Well, it depends also what people want. You either write what people want, or you write what you want people to hear, or what you want to hear, with the hope of being able to develop, as a composer, and also contribute to the development of music, of your music, if one can put it that way. It becomes very difficult. But all these things are also linked to culture and traditions. I come from a Tsonga culture, which is sometimes called Changan culture. And I feel, for instance, in this new South Africa, the last 26 years, my language has not developed at all. So this lack of development in my language of Xitsonga as a language is also contributing to a lot of lack of development in other spheres of the contribution that Shangaan or Tsonga artists are able to make, because it's remained, it has just remained there. There hasn't been any kind of development. With the development of languages, development, that it affects also development of culture, of which music falls under.
All right. That's interesting. Now I think we need to take a question from one of the listeners, another composer, Mokale, who's a well-known composer and also a very good conductor. He's asking from us, or from the composers in the panel, is there any way that African compositional techniques may be developed so that they are taught in schools and universities? There is a question for everyone. Is there a way that African compositional techniques may be developed so that they are taught in schools and universities?
Yeah, I would like to begin. Sorry, Mokale?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, so my approach to this is, people ask me why I left South Africa when I did, is I knew that I had reached the end of what I could learn from the people that were teaching me there, because they didn't have what I would call an emic engagement, i.e. an insider engagement with African music and what I needed to do. Some of us had to really go into African music by ourselves. In the same way, remember I said earlier on that part of being a composer is having the sense of curiosity, about other people's music. So, I dived in the deep end of African music in a very Pan-African way. I went into music of West Africa, East Africa, what's going on in Central Africa. And I was very fortunate also to find, people like the late Professor Nkentia, whom I got to meet in Ghana when we were performing his music with my group from Canada, and people like Akin Ayuba, the late Professor Ayuba from Nigeria, who used to come up to Toronto, performed his music. I developed my own sort of like bag of tools, I would suppose, from not only studying the other African composers, but actually going to study how African music, how music from various parts of Africa actually works. And I use, you mentioned the Mbira Mokale earlier. I use a lot of the techniques of how Shona music is constructed. The thing about having, one part playing playing a tune and then another one playing the same tune, but a note later, creating this third invisible melody. Those kinds of techniques. The Hocket style, for instance, that you find with the Babenzele Pygmy music from Central Africa, etc. I think the question is an important one, but it points to the inadequacy of the South African Academy, in that you can go through 3 or 4 years of learning music theory at a South African university, and you will never encounter the music of an African composer in the curriculum, and not in a way that's taken seriously anyway. And I think that is something that has to be rectified. I know that Mokale, when he was teaching at UNISA, was doing that. He literally, through his own efforts, was banging on every black composer's door, like, "Hey, give me your scores. I want to put them in my course." And I'm hoping that UNISA is still doing that, Mokale, after you left. But I'll leave that up to you. You can carry on.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you remember how persistent I would be in terms of getting scores, and I will continue doing that, because now I'm in a space where, for want of a better word, I call the shots of curriculum and content. It's interesting. Michael Blake introduced a course called African Composition Resources. That's when he got scores from composers like Akin Ayuba, But what I discovered was there was an imbalance in the sense that there were more scores and examples from people like Philip Glass, Steve Reich, Stanley Glasser, and a whole range of composers of European descent. Now I'm inserting the question of race in composition, but that's what I discovered, that there is this cohort of composers of European descent, writing what might be called African music, or the compositions that are inspired or influenced by African indigenous music. Then I actually made it my undertaking that I'm actually going to look for scores by African composers. That's when I started talking to people like Bongani. Andile still owes me a score. I went as far as Ghana. A friend of mine, Victor Manison, supplied me with scores. I got in touch with Victor Mabingani in the US, another South African composer who is not known to South African audiences. Yeah. So I actually created my collection of African scores, and I think that's one of the things that we need to talk about. Publishing of Africans composer scores by African composers. So I think this has to be an ongoing project. Now I'm in a space, for instance, I'm in Zambia, where you can, the colonial project, it's at its height, yet the country was liberated in 1964. I'm still shocked that no one is actually talking about what we might call as African art music. So this is yet another space, another challenge, for me. But I think the question of collecting scores, studying scores by African composers is a critical one. The course that we introduced, that was introduced by Michael Blake, it has to be developed further. That's my opinion. But at the core is availability of scores by African composers, so that we look at various compositional approaches, because I'm more interested in the plurality of styles by different composers, and that's what excites me, because Bongani writes differently from Bongani, from Musa, and from Andile Khumalo. Then I find my space in that whole field. Yeah. So and that's what African composers should actually do. That bring your own voice. It's not that you have to sound like so and so. The more different you are, I think the more exciting the space becomes.
Right. Musa, do you have some comments?
Yeah, I think it's valid points what my colleagues have said. I've always also said the same thing. Unfortunately, we do not have publishers in South Africa that are interested or that are able to publish our music. For instance, now if I want a score of a particular composer or any African composer per se, it would take a lot of searching and research to find just one piece of music. So perhaps where one should start is if somebody is interested actually in publishing this music, so that it is available for people to be able to study it. What I have been able to do so far here in Germany, I have started a little publishing company where my aim and dream is to be able to publish music of South African composers, so that it is made available also internationally with some ease. I've been able to do that with my own music and the music of my father and the music of few other composers, so that we first need to be able to collect these scores in order to be able, because you cannot teach something that you do not have. You have to be able to have this music first before you are able to teach it at universities or at schools. That's my contribution to your question.
That's a very exciting point, Musa, because I think that's one of the reasons why at the University of Fort Hare we are interested in the digital archives of South African Black choral works. Well, because that's mostly what people have composed. That we collect it and we digitize it and we find ways of protecting their intellectual property, while at the same time the music is out there. And there are also other people elsewhere, like Christine Lucia. She's really done very exciting work in terms of in terms of putting together the music. Like she's got this whole collected music of Mohapelo and the critical edition of Mohapelo and the critical edition of Morane, and I'm hoping that in the next 5 or 10 years there will be critical editions of other people written and compiled and put together by those of us who work in the academy or even outside of the academy, so that there is actually something that is out there that we can first read and have access to before we can get into the analysis and all that. But before we move on, or rather as we move on, I've got a question here from Sydney. Sydney Masekle's question is, what is your take on commissioning composers to orchestrate music of our late African composers? What will it take for justice to be done to the original compositions?
You don't need to orchestrate it. You don't need to orchestrate it. Why must we orchestrate it? The music is there.
Yeah,
the music has been composed. It is there. If you want to write music, I always tell people, for instance, music of my father, nobody must touch it. Nobody must go and take it and orchestrate it, put their own ideas. He has composed it the way he wanted to compose it. If you are a composer, go and compose your own music. This thing of arrangers, it has to stop. I tell you, nobody must touch my music. If you want to sing my music, you sing it as it is. You do not remove orchestras, you do not remove any accompaniment, you sing it as it is. If it's a cappella, you do it a cappella. Why must we now go? I say I don't like Bongani's orchestration in this particular. I don't like the opposite in Mokale's pieces, so I'm going to remove it and put. It upsets me. I'm very upset. I'm sure you have seen. I'll tell you why. Because recently I heard compositions by S.J. Kosa, by Shalade Kosa, one of the best composers of choral music we've had in South Africa. And what that man did with orchestration of his music is a scene. It's not
Michael Cheney, that's his name.
What's his name?
Michael Cheney.
Yes.
Michael Cheney.
I'm a Tsonga myself. I understand Kosa's music from the beginning right to the end. I understand him. I understand the relationship between the language, the text and the music is lost because of the orchestra. Now what it sounds like, it feeds to the narrative that black music is just rhythm. And it's not necessarily like that. We're not always hoping. It's the same thing as we do when we talk about traditional music. Every time we talk about traditions, why is it? I said to my wife the other day, I was looking at, during this 24th of September, what do you call that day? This Heritage Day.
Heritage.
That's really our heritage of South African black people. Everything has to do with pelvic movements all the time. Is that how we really dance? I don't believe it. I think somebody has just decided that these people are not good at anything else except pelvic movements. And this is the same thing. Yeah, hands off music of our people. Yeah, that's all. That's my little.
Can I say something? Can I say something? I have a very interesting experience here. When Professor Khumalo started writing in his current compositional style. That was in 1983-84. I recall I was a student at VETS at that time. And he was teaching me linguistics in the African languages department. During the day, I would be his student. In the evening, we would be colleagues. I would be accompanying his choir. But he would come in the afternoons, to the piano practicing rooms. He would dictate to me as a pianist of, as a pianist. I'm talking of Ushaga, Isbongo Gashaga. That was recorded. I accompanied his choir. That was recorded by the old Radio Bob, no, not Radio Bob, Bob Studios. It was in the 1980s. A few years later, there was an orchestration, the genesis of the orchestrating of African choral pieces. The late Professor Moni was commissioned to orchestrate Isbongos Gashag. He was my teacher. And the conductor was the late Professor Kabimgo. Then the next project was by not Robert Maxim, the late, he was at UNISA Thembela.
James, he was James.
Christopher James. Yeah,
yes.
He did Zibongos Gashaga, the orchestration of Zibongos Gashaga. They removed Walter Moni's arrangement. Later, Chris James' arrangement, orchestration, was removed. Then came Robert Maxim. And he decided to call his orchestral enhancement. Now, supposedly, enhancement from James. Well, it started with Mokale on the piano and Mokale and the choir. Then, Walter Moni. Then after Walter Moni, Chris James. After Chris James, Robert Maxim. And later, they have always been interested in the music of Mzilikazi Khumalo. I even said, I call it the scramble for Mzilikazi Khumalo. Now, interestingly, I'm glad that you mentioned what you mentioned, Musa. Interestingly, most of those people, especially Robert Maxim and Christopher James, have ownership of music. Well, it should be part ownership, but you cannot perform music without their consent.
Then don't perform it.
And they don't perform it. And I know.
They don't perform it. I mean, if somebody
is unhappy with that. Yeah, let me finish this off. I know Professor Khumalo is unhappy with that because I think the last performance of the last festival we had, the last nation performance we had, I had my own composition for choir and orchestra that was not deemed or looked at as our music in 1999, but because now I was the conductor, one of the music directors, I actually programmed it and performed my work. Then Professor Khumalo came to me and said, "You know what? I'm glad that you did this, and I'm happy with what you did. I'm impressed by your work and all that. I would like you to do the orchestration of an opera that I will be working on, which was based on the life of Kecho. But my approach then, well, unfortunately, that did not happen because of his health, situation. But if I were to sit down with Professor Khumalo, I would actually revisit what we did in the 80s, where all I do is try to get ideas from his head rather than to see what happens with this whole question of orchestrating composers. I always argue that these composers, they actually superimpose a new aesthetic language on top of that music. Then it becomes something else. Exactly. You listen a cappella, accompanied to Isbongos Gashaga and listen to the Chris James, well, which is slightly better because there's some transparency there, and the Robert Maxim work. Okay. Anyway, that's my bit, guys.
Hi, Bongani.
Well, I am so glad that all the incendiary devices exploded before I came to speak, because there were some bombs there, and I'm grateful, Musa, that you were the first one to put this discussion on the right track. And of course, I agree with you 100%, Mokale. I agree with you 100% as well. I will add my comments in reverse order, beginning with what Mokale has said and then what Musa has said. There is a master's thesis at the University of Stellenbosch written by one Philip Skonken, who's a composer there. I think he lectures there as well, composition. And he takes the matter of Ushaka in a very scholarly and very analytical way and compares the various orchestrations. And I think the salient question that he asks is, whose Shaka is it? And it's available. I think it is still available online if you go to the library.
I have a copy.
Yeah, okay, cool. Because I quoted a couple of things from it for my PhD, and I also quoted some of the stuff that the other fellow, I forget his name now. But this is partly the reason why I encourage people to be curious about music. I mean, orchestration, yes, you can go to a class, but most of the discovery that you make about orchestration is you literally deep down in the Rite of Spring or whoever's music that you like, finding out like how did they get these sounds out of the orchestra. Having that level of curiosity. And I must say, when I came to age as a composer in my late teens, this mess was transpiring. This whole shenanigans was going on. And I think it would be amiss to not acknowledge that there was a political agenda behind this. I mean, this was during the transition to democracy, and the South African musical establishment had not done enough to create a cohort of composers whose music could be readily played by a symphony orchestra. And symphony orchestras, on the other hand, and classical music, as the South African classical music establishment was mostly white, was desperate to be seen as being transformed and, you know, African, and it's like, hey, you know, we do black things as well, kind of thing. So this was a rush job, you know, that they did, and it was messy. I mean, it's aesthetically it's a mess, artistically it's a mess, because like as the question that Philip Skonken says in his paper, it was like, whose work is this? And then the third thing that deeply offends me personally as a black African composer is, why do we need white saviors? And I think that's the genesis of your anger, Musi. It's like these people that have to come and rescue our music. and you very eloquently says, like, leave my father's music alone. It does not need any rescue. And I think the next generation of young South African composers really needs to get on the job of being, you know, comfortable with the orchestra, having a fluency with instrumental writing. And I think a lot of the reason why that is not happening, as we know, the South African music establishment always has gatekeepers, you know. Yeah. I have been lucky in that I think because of my North American experience, I generally am not very shy. You know, I knock on doors. If there's a door, I'll make one for myself and I'll walk through. I mean, a case in point, for instance, just a story is I was living in Cape Town at the time, and it was like the 50th anniversary of the death of Ingrid Jonker, and, you know, President Mandela had quoted Ingrid Jonker's poem, Die Kind. which is about the child that died in the township outside of Cape Town during the riots in the 60s. And Mandela had quoted the poem, and of course, Ingrid Jonker died under very tragic circumstances, committing suicide by walking into the ocean. And I said, well, nobody's going to do anything about this. Let me go and knock on the Cape Town Philharmonic Orchestra's door. And I said, guys, let's do this. I'll write the music. And it's like, well, but we don't have the money. It's like, you know what? I'll go and ask my friends to donate money so that we can commission me to write this thing, because I don't write without a commission. It happened. And then this is what, 2016, 2017. That was the first orchestral piece of music that the Cape Town Philharmonic had programmed into their subscription series that was written by a Black South African composer in 2016. We cannot carry on like this, you know. We need to encourage, and the people who have the power, who run these institutions, need to mentor and need to nurture the next generation of Black composers so that they do not need their music to be rescued by other people who are going to orchestrate it on their behalf. That's the first point, responding to Musa. And on the other hand, it is the composers who do not come from an African tradition, and I have an issue with them, who try in a very superficial way, try just by, you know, imposing a little bit of rhythm there, or maybe giving a piece an African name in a language that they don't even understand or speak. And they claim that that's a form of embracing African culture. I mean, it is, at best, it's what Edward Said in his book Orientalism would call exoticism, you know, an imagining of the other. And it has no deep engagement with, you know, with our languages. And I think you hinted at that, Musa. It's like, how can you engage with this music and all you want is rhythm, but you actually don't understand the cadences and the meter of the language and the nuances and the meanings and the layers of meanings and that kind of stuff. So there is that element as well of composers who do not come from the African tradition, think that they can fake their way through our culture. But they can do that because they come very well resourced in terms of having agency. You know, they've got the Sibelius on their computer, and, you know, they have electricity at home and they can sit and do this stuff. And, you know, and so there is that as well. And I would urge young composers, young South African composers, to be very careful that they do not find themselves in these terrible predicaments where they find themselves in collaborations with people and they're having their ideas somehow being extracted out of them, remolded, refashioned, and they end up doing most of the creative lifting and the other person just jazzes things up and makes them nice. That's the other thing that we should actually shine a spotlight on. I'm not going to mention names. People know who they are and what they did.
May I add something? Just one little thing. You see, I agree with Bongani completely, and also what Mokale has said. There is also another element to this whole thing. You know, the National Choir Festival is also not innocent in this whole exercise, because you find, you know, there is these competitions. Well, they are good because people love it and they love to go and sing. I know I'll probably get blasted for saying this, but it's true. We have to talk about this. We have to start talking about this. Instead of, you know, these 18th and 19th century prescriptions that they always get. I mean, I'm going back to what you said earlier about our music, and because when you write something that sounds too modern for them, they rather go back to Mozart and Haydn, because that is there. They feel that Mozart and Haydn belong more to them than your music belong to. So this is also something that we have to look into. It addresses also this question that Mokale has asked earlier. How are we going to be able to, are we going to be able to teach our music, African music theories and compositional techniques? It has to start, well, on a smaller scale, yes, but on a bigger scale too, because we already have things that are going on that are against all these other possibilities that we would be able to do as African composers or as African musicians who want our music to develop. This is something that also, I know that we are on a platform sponsored by Old Mutual, but it does not stop one from saying that the Old Mutual National Choir Festival hasn't played its part in helping for the development of choral music or of developing African composers in South Africa. It's an important thing I had to take off my heart.
Mokale?
Yeah, Mina, I think part of the problem is funding and politics of funding and sponsorship. Some of these guys who come as saviors of African music and do that, it's because they have funding. They are seen as the best candidates that should be funded for their projects. They have a history with funding organizations and festivals and organizations that put some of these events together. I wish there could be a special fund that could be set aside for the development of African composers, African compositions, staging of African compositions, where we write our own music, perform our own music. We write what we like and present what we like. But I think on the other hand, to deal with the colonial legacy mission to get our audiences and choirs to really appreciate something new. The late Nomia started in terms of changing the choral compositional language, but I think we need to move further than that. Well, obviously, having to throw choirs take them from Nomia and throw them to Andile Khumalo would be quite some project, and I wish there could be somebody brave.
But it must be done.
It should be done. Yes, it should be. That's why I'm saying that it's going to be difficult. But now Musa raises a very important question. I've always argued that, you see, because our choirs are so in competitions and they really want to compete, they want to be seen in the competition space. Now is the role of, I once served in that committee, and I know the thinking. I'm sorry, I just have to say it. I know the thinking. Even though I was with somebody quite controversial, Louis van Dijk, then I have an experience with him in another space. Prescriptions that we have, and what we suggested was thrown out, and we were both out of the prescription committee. Well, I guess that's the problem of getting to
Mokale, you're breaking. Can I chip in? Can I chip in right there? Gentlemen, can I chip in right there?
Yes.
Right. I feel that for me, the way forward is pretty much along what the Schubertians did. If anyone knows anything about the Schubertians, Yes, I can hear you now. So what I'm saying is that Schubert, one of the ways in which he made his music popular was to actually have a very small number of people that he composed for and that listened to his music in his small concerts in his home or sometimes in the home of the funders. I think maybe one way in which we can produce all these exciting works that kind of right against the grain is really to have small ensembles, small groups of people that come together and maybe sample or perform someone's music, and maybe from there we can move forward, because I think within these very big spaces of choral competitions, big national choral competitions, it's just not possible. Everyone there wants Mozart. Everyone there wants everything. Everyone there wants Verdi. They want everything that has been heard. Whereas I think if we move towards composing for smaller ensembles that can have smaller concerts, and we are able to host these and have maybe 20, 30 people to come and listen and engage with the music, I think that could be the way forward.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I've never been involved with the choral music scene. I don't know how it works. I just know that these massive competitions that happens in South Africa. But one thing that I do sense is that there's a lot of gatekeeping that goes on, which I don't think serves music very well, doesn't serve the art form very well. And I don't know if the solution is creating smaller venues where experimentation can happen. I mean, I don't know what kind of an impact that will have, but it certainly is a great idea. But I think we have to acknowledge that there's a lot of people sitting around in a committee kind of setting with a great deal of access to resources, and that gives them power. And they've been making decisions that I don't think are very helpful in terms of getting progressive voices into the system. There was a point that I'm watching the comments that the folks on the internet are sending to us, and there are some brilliant, ideas coming out of there. But there seems to be a consensus, as I'm seeing from here. There's Musa Selek and various other people that seem to point at the academy, that the academy has a responsibility in terms of curriculum to, again, there it is, it's coming up again, that there seems to be an intervention that the academy needs to do. Now, the question there is, does that happen formally within like in the degree program? Which I think would be highly ineffective, because most folks who are practicing in the choral music scene are not necessarily enrolled in a degree program, in a specialist degree music program. So how can this intervention that the tertiary, the academy that will make, how will that intervention be inclusive to include people who are non-degree students, who actually need the knowledge and who actually have an ability to apply the knowledge in their communities, in their choirs, and in the course of these competitions? How I don't know. Does anybody have any ideas around that? Maybe Mokale.
Can I chip in right there?
Yes,
yes. I think I've got a feminist background. You know, I studied feminism as theory and practice and all that. And one of the things that I gathered from feminism and also Black studies, I've also worked on that, is that what made feminism to be a discipline is that women came together and said, we want this in the academy, we want to push this and they set the agenda. and feminism was introduced into all sorts of studies, starting with literature, starting with gender studies, gender and sexuality studies, and then others followed suit, like gender and queer theory and all of that. I think we are the ones who want to be answerable to ourselves. We know what we want. For me, I imagine an academy in South Africa where Black institutions take the responsibility of doing what we want. Stellenbosch might not do the kinds of things we want. Vets might not do the kinds of things we want to do. Another place might not do. I think Black institutions need to be the bearers of knowledge and creativity that Black people want, that Black people value. Our Black histories, our Black intellectual property, our Black creativity needs to be bred and nurtured in those spaces. You're not going
Hang
to have
on. Why should this be limited to historically Black universities? Why are you excusing Stellenbosch University? You know, they got a huge pile of money from Mellon Foundation to open something called Africa Open. Okay, an institute that is run by Stephanus Müller, a famous South African music scholar. Now, I presume that under Africa, that means Black people, right, in there? Correct me?
I'm not sure how many Black people are there. And I think Bongani, my interest really is that let's do this thing for ourselves as a start. Every other person can follow, every other person can join us, you know, but I think
I'm not willing to recuse these guys, I'm sorry.
Okay, Mokale?
Yeah, no, that's the reason I talk about politics of funding. Right? Bongani, yes, you don't want to excuse them and give, the whole issue under the carpet. I admire that. But I guess I'm the oldest here. And my experience tells me that, that you'll be squeezing blood out of stone. White academia, it's unfortunate that we talk about white academia this day and age. White academia will never change. That's my position. And I agree with Thembela that let's do things for ourselves. Earlier on in the chat space, I talked about the Chineke orchestra. There's a conversation that is happening there. People would want to replicate what Chineke is doing in the UK, in South Africa. And I got out of that conversation because I realized that it's a group of white musicians and organizers of events in South Africa who want to do something that Chineke is doing in the UK, do it here in South Africa. And I have a problem with the ideological positioning of that. Chineke in the UK, it's a group of Black musicians and what they call minority musicians. In South Africa, why should we have, in the UK, they decided to do something for themselves because they've been, because of issues of exclusion. In South Africa, I still find it difficult that why should a white person still want to do something for me? So, Thembela, in 2011, I had a huge fight with Shadrach Bukamba and the JPO regarding the exclusion of Black composers, in subscription performances, not just outreach programs. I have a problem. I want to go to a subscription performance of the JPO, of the Cape Town Philharmonic Orchestra, to listen to a premiere of a Bongani Ndodana or a Andile Khumalo or a Musa, not listen to Bongani Ndodana when Johannesburg Philharmonic Orchestra or CTO does an outreach program in the township. I have a problem with, circumstances, that the fight went on. But Bongani, perhaps because I'm getting closer to my exit point because of age, I would rather do something with you guys rather than having to expect somebody to consider me in their, budget, the next budget, to be in that. No. I would like to be involved in an ongoing program. We will have our own funding, and that funding will be specifically for the development of black composers, development of and creation of new repertoire. That's my piece, guys.
But what you are having at the moment, and it's such a pity that we can't get Andile Khumalo on the line because his internet is down.
Yeah.
But I mean, you have an embarrassing situation. I was, a Radcliffe Fellow at Harvard University, and my colleagues over at Berkeley, one of them came and we were having lunch and mentioned Andile's name. It's like, wow, we're doing this piece by the South African composer Andile. It's like, yeah, I know Andile very well.
Yes.
Boston having lunch, and Andile is having his work being premiered by Ensemble Modern. Okay. This is like the premier contemporary classical new music group on the planet, followed in that whole league with Ensemble Intercontemporain, which Pierre Boulez used to run. Not one South African orchestra has ever commissioned Andile or performed his work. That's embarrassing. And you have Musa, who has just finished a cello concerto. I think it's about half an hour. It's being premiered in Germany next September. You have me, there's just a work of mine that was performed in New York under lockdown, and I've got another commission from Stanford University that hopefully after the Rona will be performed in a festival in February 2022 in California. But I think most of us are doing what we need to do overseas. We're not really worried if South African orchestras are playing our music. But I think after a while, South African orchestra managers are going to be running into people in Germany. It's like, hey, have you heard of Musa Nkuna? We've just listened to his cello concerto. And I'm just wondering what they're going to think and say. And I think that what Andile is doing with Ensemble Modern is an absolute coup, a wonderful coup. And it's such a pity that folks have to go abroad and get their music performed at these very prestigious platforms.
Yeah, something quite interesting, and I told you about it, Bongani, is that I'm commission for new orchestra of Washington. And I've got to complete it by the 31st of December, and it will be premiered next year, March. Well, depending on how things pan out in the US regarding lockdowns and COVID. But that is my first full orchestral commission at my age. All right. Anyway, it's okay. I'm okay with it. But it's interesting that we only experience and enjoy these privileges outside the country. And by the way, in 2011, when I had that debacle with the JPO, Dr. Grant Ulrich organized a symposium where we discussed about this thing. And one of the people who was part of that, who was in the panel, was the CEO of Cape Town Philharmonic Orchestra. He made an undertaking that they will commission me to write a work for the CPO. I am still waiting. That is 10 years later. I am done with these guys, Bongani. At my age, I choose my battles well. I will never win battles. Interestingly, the KZN Philharmonic calls me. I think it must be around 2014. Calls me that they'll be informing me that they have started a program where they encourage students to submit works for orchestras. Would I be interested in submitting my work? And I showed them the middle finger. That you create a space for student composers, and you also include me in that lot. I am sorry, so my brother, I'm done with this.
Yes, you're black. You're a black composer. You're not good enough.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, we'll forever be regarded as student composers. Yeah, I guess.
So we as black musicians, as black scholars, as black performers, as black workers, as black everything, we're always the ones that need to be developed. We're the ones that need to be put in some kind of a learnership that goes on for years, and we're always up and coming, regardless of having worked in an institution for 20 plus years. You're always up and coming. But of course, the other people, they get into the institution, and within 2 years, they are ready. Gentlemen, we have something like 10 minutes left. And I would like some closing thoughts on this, strictly for about 5 minutes, because after that, Smoo is going to play us out with some of your music. Bongani, I think you have a hand.
Well, I wanted to have my hand up because the conversation was going into doom and gloom, and I don't want young composers to be discouraged about us being frustrated about certain things. I mean, a part of being a composer is having this, unshakable belief in yourself, and being able to weather through the storms. And I think, I look up to Mokale because he was there before most of us were even professional composers. He was there in the thick of things. From my vantage point of view, which is not South Africa specific, because my music doesn't get played as much in South Africa and my commissions don't come mostly from here. I've noticed in the big and established markets of classical music, especially in the UK and in North America, that through various efforts of many people, there is a resurgence of interest in composers of African descent. There's been a festival organized around the music of Florence Price, the African-American woman composer, and that cohort of composers, Undine Smith, Margaret Barnes, etc. And, I think the circle of interest around the music of William Grant Still, we're finding out, it's all growing. The BBC Radio 3 has a wonderful series hosted by a British Jamaican black woman composer. And so there is an interest in the wider international classical music world of creating diversity. And orchestras, for instance, in America, when they announce a season, they are being scrutinized on how many new compositions are they playing, how many pieces are there by women composers, and how many pieces are they commissioning or playing by composers, by minority composers in that case over there. It's interesting enough that when the Metropolitan Opera comes out of Corona, the first opera that they are putting on in their new season is by Terence Blanchard, a black composer. And we've seen in the past season, it's the first time in the history of the Met that they're doing, they've commissioned, that they're putting on an opera by black composers. And in the past season, we saw out there in Long Beach in California, we saw his name is Anthony. What's Anthony's last name again? I forget. But he did Amistad, and now he did the opera on the Central Park 5. Anthony Davis, that's him. So there's a resurgence, and I think Philadelphia, for instance, has appointed a Black woman composer advisor. So you are seeing a greater degree of inclusion that's happening. And of course, somebody mentioned, Mokale, you mentioned the great work that Chichi is doing with Chineke in the UK.
Yes.
One of my good friends, Roderick Cox, has just conducted a concert with them. And so you are seeing the complexion of classical music, of instrumental classical music and orchestras slowly changing. And I'm hoping that South Africa would keep up with that international trend of being A, more diverse, celebrating diversity, B, encouraging inclusion. That's my 2 cents.
Anyone else? Musa, Mokale? We've got 2 minutes.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the most important things is creating a space where our works will be performed at home. You'll be surprised at the number of scores that have sold in the US and in Europe. And I wish we had a situation.
I can just say.
Right. Mokale Koapeng.
Yeah, I wish we were, had that space where we, our audiences, our people, well, we've difficulties with definition of that, but where our works will be performed and make our people be aware of what we are actually doing, because it doesn't make sense that and I do understand, but it doesn't make sense that we enjoy these opportunities outside the country and not have those spaces. So the question of funding, the question of creating space, we talked about publishing. We need to create a library of works by composers of African descent. In this case, South African composers. Bongani, I left UNISA. I'm not sure if I doubt if they're continuing with that project, but I will reactivate it where I am right now.
Musa, go ahead.
You're able to hear me now? Yes, yeah. Well, I think it was a great conversation for me to talk to my fellow composers and exchange ideas and so on. And now I'm sure that we are all aware, and especially lovers of choral music by South African composers, that South Africa has more than 5 or 6 composers. We need to create a space. We need to create a space for that, because this is another problem. I mean, we have to speak. We have to start having honest conversations. It rotates always around the same people, as if they're the only composers that exist in South Africa. And South Africa has a lot of talent. There are so many composers. But if we just keep concentrating on the same people, there won't be any kind of development. Well, if people want this to develop, will develop. Those of us who have possibilities to leave South Africa, because it's like you train rugby players and then you spread the glasses on the grass on the rugby fields that they're supposed to play on. It's impossible. That's why people have to leave. Funds are there, the money is there. I mean, things should be able to happen. But we as I always say, it's very difficult to deal with each other because we don't support each other. We never really, I mean, this is honest. We don't support each other, and we need to make the circle a bit bigger. As Bongani says, we really have to it's got to be a little bit more inclusive than the way it is going now. So I never attended, this NCF, it has become meaningless actually in many ways, because it's just the same thing that has been done over the past 40 years, no development, nothing at all. And you see a lot of this also in concert halls. I mean, who wants to hear the Beethoven's Ninth every year?
Right. Let me close off right there, and thank you very much, gentlemen, for your contribution. It would have been lovely to have a lady or two ladies in the conversation. And so, as we close off, we would really like to encourage ladies to compose. We want to acknowledge Usisweziwe Mvandala as a composer, as a choral composer, but we also want to invite many others. There is Uma Mutsambo as a composer. There are a few ladies out there who compose, but quite frankly, we don't know maybe more than 5. We'd like to see their works being composed. We'd like to see their works being performed. We would like more presence of ladies, of females within this space, within this conversation. As we close off, Mr. Njeza would like to play us out with the music of the composers that we listened to. And as we started in the when we're early in the program, we spoke about whether their music, that is the kind of music that Bongani and Mokale and Musa compose, whether their music is actually like our music. And we want to close off by letting people hear this kind of music that is both our music, not our music.
Thank you so much, TV. This has been an interesting conversation. I learned a lot. Later in the conversation, sparks were flying, and I thought gloves were going off. But of course, it's all for the love of music. It's all for the love of the genre, and to encourage young composers like myself. I still consider myself as a young composer because these are my seniors. And that is why today I chose to be in the background and work behind the scenes and just listen on. You know, every time I'm asked about my experience as a composer, I always tell people how I tried to run away from this thing of writing music. It just kept, catching up with me until I gave up and I started learning because there was music playing that I had to respond to. So thank you so much, TV, and thank you so much to the guests that we had this afternoon. As we are going out of the stream, I am going to play 3 pieces, just 2 minutes each. It's just very short excerpts so that people can hear the kind of music. In fact, they're not limited to these pieces. They write quite a diverse kind of music by the 3 composers. I'm going to include a piece by Dr. Andile Khumalo, even though he couldn't make it to the stream, so that people can also hear and be clear about his music. Next week, I will be having a conversation with a young group of musicians who came together to form an organization called Opportunity, where among other projects that they will be doing this year is this production of Janis Kiki at the end of November. The young musicians there, which is an interesting project. So I will see you next week. Thank you so much, TV. There's a challenge or an opinion or an encouragement that we are sharing with you, TV, at the University of Fort Hare, because there's a lot of issues that were raised by the composers here. And I know you guys at the University of Fort Hare were the ones who initiated this conversation from last year with only Mokale and Mr. Teenage Mahlangeni. I'm encouraging you guys to organize a symposium for composers and invite these composers and many other South African composers so that these issues can be dealt with and young composers can learn more from these experienced composers. So everyone who joined the stream, thank you so much. We are going to listen to Harmonia Ubuntu by Bongani Ndodana first.